here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the composer, writer and performer and singer. It's the one and only Sananda Maitreya, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry, all that other groovy stuff, and also the creative process. It's an amazing interview, so do take notes. I will test you at the end. Has got a tour coming up October, November 2025. I will put a link to his website in the notes below. First came onto the kind of music rock pop scene in the, I suppose it was like 87, introducing the Hardline, which had various chart-bound hits, Sign Your Name and also Dance Little Sister. Has been very prolific recently and has it's got a huge body of work which we talk about in this interview. And yes, we begin the interview really talking about an album that came out in 2001. This was titled, if I got my notes properly here, yes, Wild Card, and like the transition and transformation of that particular period in his life. Also, just to say that my recording of this, my vocals weren't that great, so I've had to sort of add those, but everything else is absolutely pure and simple, so just sit back, relax and enjoy. But anyway, Sananda, it's over to you. Tell us about the period when you recorded Wild Card.
I first of all, bear in mind that the way Scorsese sees his films, or the way a film director sees his films, every film I make, every film I manage to get out is important for me. It's not just be as the kind of sales guy going, why, yes. It's just the truth, is that these things for me, and this is why, for example, I had to be in this independent space to be able to be in a space where I feel like all artists deserve or need to be in a space where, of course, if they're ready to assume responsibility for the art, where you're just creating what is there forming within you without having to go through all these checklists and check boxes and make sure that somebody from this department is okay with it, and then somebody from that department has to sign off on it. All of that stuff, all of that soul-destroying, spirit-killing stuff, I really needed to get away from, because what happens is you become adept at using your creative abilities to transform into the shape of something that is malleable for people who may or may not even be in that position in a few months. So to be an artist and to be shaped by people who have to make decisions only based on their own survival is not conducive, in my mind, to a long-term vision of great art. And for me, legacy and creating a body of work was far more important, if I had to choose between one or the other, than just making music that was dictated by quarterly results and whatever was trending at that particular time. I needed to get out of that toxic world. Wild Card's importance was the fact that it was the last album I made under the old setup, under the old system, as the system existed then. The thing to remember is that I was parallel and very much part and part of that era where things were transitioning. The old order was breaking down and the new order was being visited upon us. So Wild Card was even made in the atmosphere of Napster and Sean, I can't remember Sean's last name off the top of my head, but the gentleman who basically broke the bank wide open, or, exposed the dam in the system with Napster. So I was simultaneous with all that. I was hearing all of these things. I can remember in the mid-90s, I can remember very clearly getting the very clear idea that my way forward was being presented through what was burgeoning at the time, was the sense that the internet would be that distribution network which would allow artists to break free of total corporate hegemony and basically to just grow naturally and have a space in which to grow naturally, where certain decisions and distinctions they didn't have to make. So that was the significance of Wild Card, was that it was simultaneous to the breakdown of the old order as the new order was presenting itself as possibility and as fact. And so it was also this conscious decision. That particular album was the last album I wanted to commit my vision to, which used the studio itself as a primary instrument of creation. I had gone as far as I wanted to go, okay, and I'm very, very, very proud of the record, very proud of my work. But I remember, since I knew I would be free in a completely different way afterwards, I wanted to focus my vision in the future on records that sounded a lot more just kind of naturally organic and from the ground, without the expertise of those immaculate Los Angeles recording studios and techniques. So that's what I remember. And I just remember that, like, the way you're painting a picture in a glossy kind of way, or in a way that, you know, this is the culmination of a series of recordings that very much constitute that Los Angeles period of my career. So, you know, but Wild Card is the nexus between that life and the life that we're now basically living in now. So it was very important on so many different levels, but it remains a landmark for me because also of just what it represented.
The next part of the interview, I sort of talk about the 2021 album release, which is a really massive piece of work and absolutely stunning, titled Pandora's Playhouse, which, to be honest, when I listened to it, had sort of moments which reminded me of the album by Prince, which was Sign of the Times. And yes, this is mentioned, and this is Sananda's response to that.
The backdrop of all that is that there were a couple of things going on simultaneously. Let's say eating away at each ear. One ear was being absorbed, fending off a gentleman who had been asking me for pretty much over a decade, or close to 2 decades, if you will, if we could collaborate on orchestral works, because we became good friends through another event where we met one another at this particular musical event. And we really hit it off. And so it's like every 2 years, I seem to get a call from this guy saying, hey, you know, maybe now would be a great time to do this orchestral project. Simultaneous to that, off and on, I had been invited by the National Theater. At one point, I had been invited by the National Theater of Italy to put together a musical centered around my work. And so these things were kind of happening simultaneously. When Pandora's Playhouse was coming together, it was as I'd been approached again to perhaps put together something for the theater. And bear in mind, David, that the very beginning of Post Millennium Rock, like the very next project, Angels and Vampires, after Wild Card, the blueprint was, it was no longer a challenge for me to come up with, 14, 15 songs. From that point, I wanted there to be some other sort of incentives. So the decision was made that from Angels and Vampires onwards, every album would have to also be its own mini opera, its own play that could be mounted as its own story and own set of songs that supported one another, while at the same time having to be supportive of this larger sort of Tolkien inspired vision of the Zoathlon and this whole universe, creating these characters and these, using these archetypal characters that we have been indoctrinated in our Western civilization. So while all of that was going on, then finally lockdown happened, where I couldn't really deal with the theater thing because of lockdown, and we couldn't deal with the orchestral thing because of lockdown. But in any event, I had said to both situations, look, I'm not ready yet, because Pandora's Playhouse was crucial to the rest of the development of that particular story. That's kind of how that all came about, is that, I was fending off these 2 streams that finally did arrive on the Pegasus project, that I finally capitulated to on the Pegasus project. But Pandora's Playhouse was just important for me to finish. Again, David, it's like I have these films I have to make, and I have to make these films, and then everything else can come after that in the larger picture. But I hope that it kind of explains it, that all of these are consequential.
And from that particular point, I then talk about a track which is on the second track on side 2, or volume 2 in this case, sticking with the same album that we were talking about, Pandora's Playhouse, which is titled Reflecting Light, and it does feature on vocals Bastian Bunyan, who had an amazing song called Another Diamond Day, which is one of my personal favourites, and I mentioned this, and also just curious how this, how they collaborated, or not so much collaborated, but how Bastian became part of that track.
Peripherally, I hadn't centered or focused on her until I realized I was going to work with her, and then her name rang a bell, and I was like, wait, Vashti Bunyan, where have I heard this name before? And then, of course, when I went back and looked it up, I was like, oh, yes, of course. And I just remember, mentioning to a couple of people that I was involved in a project with her, and, they were rather impressed, so, it was one of those things where you kind of like unwrap a present and you realize there's a bonus attached to it that you didn't anticipate. That's what that was, because when I was first contacted by the Avalanches, to collaborate, that was the main focus, is what we were going to do together. So the fact that Madame Vashti came later was just a very pleasant surprise. I'm happy to be associated with her.
Indeed, if you get a chance, do check out the album Pandora's Playhouse. Another track that we talk about, or I bring up, which is on side 1, or volume 1 of this, the 7th track on side 1, Yuki Suzuki, which is another one of those songs that if you haven't heard, do go and check it out, because it's absolutely superb. And this is Sananda, responding to one of my questions, or just interest about how this song came about.
Let me see if I can think of their specific. Well, some songs have origin stories, and some songs just basically materialize out of thin air, which don't always leave a story, a narrative attached to it. Yuki Suzuki was, I can't remember exactly. I just remember that, I was dealing at the time with something Japanese. It might have been the media or the press or something, where I was just put in that frame of mind. But I'm sure there was something else. I vaguely have a memory of something being the main catalyst, but what I basically remember is around the time that came to me, I was finalizing the arrangement for the Ballad of Rod Steiger, and I remember being in the mountains, where oftentimes when I have a batch of songs and I've arranged them, I might go, just to be away in solitude for a few days, just to basically be alone with the arrangements and make sure I'm happy with the way everything is going. And, very often tending music produces more music. So I do remember around that time, Yuki Suzuki came to me. I was in the mountains for sure. I was working or finalizing or polishing the arrangement for the Ballad of Rod Steiger. And I think that's when it came to me. And it could have possibly been connected to the fact that because I was working on Rod Steiger, I might have actually been remembering one of his roles where he had a Japanese girlfriend or something. Because, that's back in the days when, people were allowed to play other ethnicities.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And so, if any ethnic-looking white dude could play like any other ethnic dude, you know what I mean? So yes. it might have been something like that, but it was also, sometimes it's, I think it was also an emotional love letter to just the fact that when Japanese culture embraces you, there is something very innocent about their affection, as much as anything else. There's that kind of nature that never really grows up that I think appeals to the inner child in any artist. So it just also might have been just an ode of appreciation to the way they've always regarded, my work.
And lastly, still sticking with the same album, but also very curious about Prince, the last track on side 2, which is actually titled Prince, is another point that I sort of bring to Sananda to ask him if Prince is somebody that is still very much on his mind, and yes, how influential was the great man?
I think the simplest way to realize is like, when you see a cloud, a massive cloud in the sky, a huge cumulus cloud, and then you keep watching it, and before you realize it, the cloud has basically become 4 or 5 other clouds. Mm-hmm. This is the way I regard my relationship to our spirit. There's only so much of a harvest that can fit into a barrel. So you have a huge vineyard, and that vineyard is a famous vineyard that produces classic wines or whatever. And so he was put into one bottle, and a label was slapped on it, and he was shipped where he was shipped. And I, from the same vintage, a few years later, was placed in another bottle and shipped somewhere else, because that's the way of it. So since you can't fit all of that into one barrel or one thing, you spread it out, because there's the vineyard that produces this particular wine. So we always felt like we came from the same vineyard. I always gave him his space because I kind of needed to. Again, it was always clear to for example, there were many, many times when he would have a song title, and then I would have a song title like that, and I would just choose not to record it or change it into something else. That happened a lot. Basically, we were on very similar wavelengths, and we understood that, even to the point where we even had a telepathic resonance or communication with one another, where I would know when he needed me to call, and he would know when I needed him to check in. There's only a couple people I really kind of have that with, and he, as far as artists, Springsteen would be another, where there's just this kind of psychic connection where you just kind of know when to reach out to the other. So, this past tense, the cosmology of how I see existence is that, as the natives and the ancients believe, nothing dies. We transform into other whatever, into dimensional spaces where a density of the third dimension is like, okay, why do I still need this car? I've driven this car my whole life. It's been a great car, but it's not capable of getting me around where I need to go at this point. So I'll give up this car. So the car is what is like the physical body. The driver doesn't die. The car dies. The car just, boom. Then the driver moves on. It's like, where are we now? Well, we will see where we need to be next. But that car wasn't working for us anymore. The pains, the accumulated pains and the stresses and the traumas of the life of a great artist like Prince, at some point, it's like a shelf life. It's like, what the fuck? When you need to be densely medicated to continue a journey where you really have nothing left to prove, then what the fuck do you still need to be in a tortured existence for? Okay? And so emotionally, there are times when I would like for him to be here physically, but it's mainly to do with him relating to my sons. My own relationship with him doesn't need him to be in a physical body for me to understand that his spirit and his nature is present, or that we share that particular spirit or nature. So it's not just relating to me and him. It's the same with, let's say, me and George Michael. There are certain people that you come from the same crew. And at some point, you'll get back on the fucking spaceship when the mission is over. You'll go back to planet whatever the hell you come from. And you'll shake hands and laugh about the stories you collected while you were in such a treacherous, mean-spirited fucking place, but that needed your service, that needed the love that you had to give. So it's not unusual for artists to believe in what are called metaphysical things, because so much of our inspiration comes from these unknown places anyway that we can't necessarily intellectualize. So we are prone to believing that there is more to life than just meets the very limited frequency of the human visual range.
And on that point, the next issue, or not issue so much, but the next kind of intrigue that I had was really talking about artists and when they make their work in different stages of their life. And I sort of talk about sometimes in the early years, there's an innocence or purity, which kind of gets reflected in the releases they do, which are often the kind of classic work, whereas with time and the passage of episodes that happen and sometimes some ups and downs and where people can suddenly find themselves getting sort of, I don't know, bitter and twisted. Sometimes the music or the art that they produce isn't quite so incredible. And I was just curious what Sananda sort of made of that fantastic idea that I had. Well, it was the best I could do, really.
We all have a pulse. There's a pulse. There's, as much as we try to analyze why this artist and not this artist, it's that something ineffable that we recognize. It's a message, it's a tone. If you bury that tone up too much with indecision, if you bury that tone too much with trying to please too many other sectors of the market, that tone gets buried beneath all those other decisions, okay? But the music that we tend to make before we have to encounter all of these other considerations that had nothing to do with our beginning, that's when we risk to get buried underneath, other people's desires and other people's projections of what we could be, what we should be, how much more we could do, and all this bullshit that is just a part of going through the corporate world as an artist, okay? If you can survive it, if you do survive it, it's a priceless education.
And on that point, I sort of bring up the subject of probably a lot of the major artists from the 80s, Prince, Michael Jackson, Madonna, and also Morrissey. And obviously, two of those people have passed away. Madonna has gone through quite a lot of stages. And with Morrissey, I was a massive Smiths fan, have to confess. But in later life, I realised that some of his solo albums have not been quite as beautiful as some of his early ones, in my opinion. Obviously, people might disagree with that. But I sort of wondered if, with time and sometimes bitterness or sort of frustration or anger, perhaps that's kind of been one of the reasons some of the music hasn't had that sort of magic kind of sort of emotion in the music, the lyrics, etc. And Sananda responds to that.
This is what the situation is. They provide one way. Until now, this is why now is the best time in history to be an artist. Okay? Because it doesn't take much to find your bitches. It just doesn't. You just have to have an authentic thing that people respond to or like and feel. And then, people gather around that thing. You can develop a relationship at your own pace and your own time. The thing is, it's easy to blame someone, like Morrissey or anyone for being bitter and twisted when the fucking process is designed to make us bitter and fucking twisted, dude. It's like this. You look, let me just tell you firsthand. Performers in general don't do any more drugs by volume than bankers, lawyers, surgeons, doctors, any other professional bitches, okay? If you can get your hands on good stuff, generally people will do it. Particularly in high-stress professions like chefs and surgeons. You just do, okay? But why do we die so early? Why do we die so fucking early? It's the bitterness, it's the twistedness, it's the expectations, it's the exploitation, it's the way you wake up by the time you finally get a sensibility and realize they didn't want you when you were finally awake and can see what's going on. They wanted you when you were young, dumb, and full of fucking cum. Okay? And that's when because that's when you were ripe for exploitation. That's when, rather than looking at your future, you were looking at the magazine covers that you were on. Okay? That's when you couldn't have possibly known the resentment that the president who was making money from you and advancing his career from you also resented that while he was on his third marriage, you were banging the current model that's on the cover of Vogue. And your Lamborghini is parked in the fucking, parking lot, and you're 23. And he's 48. He's on his third marriage. And she's kicking his ass. okay? And so even if you're helping advance his career, human nature says that unless you develop some kind of relationship with him, he's got it in for you, even as he is profiting from you, okay? It is a mean-spirited thing. And by the time you come through it with the genuineness of your spirit, you've been raped. So, yes, there's a lot of us who are exploited, who particularly come from and through the working classes, who don't have cultures of therapy, who don't have cultures that understand what it's like to be in this particular world, and then just so discard it as yesterday's thing. And where you bring people to them, they take those people from you to the point where then you come back and these people don't want to hear anything except what was promoted. While obviously it's in a company's best interest to promote the idea that what they have of your work is your best work. Okay? It isn't in their best interest to acknowledge, actually, he's grown, he's matured, his bodies of work have become blah, blah, blah. They don't give a fuck because they're not profiting from that. So it doesn't make any sense for them to mythologize to the contrary, that your best years are what they have. So yeah, we're in a trap, and unless you manage, like I did, to get the hell out before it's too late, your fate is pretty inevitable. You're either going to die or you're going to die inside.
Yes. A few years ago, I did.
But let's still support music. Hey.
Indeed. And the next point that I bring up really is this idea of the victim, and kind of in relationship to some of the workshops I did in my younger days with Tony Robbins, who was one of these people who did weekend workshops on sort of how to empower your life, and the idea of this sense of being a victim. And sometimes if one takes that role in a position or situation, it sometimes makes one a little bit more, what one would say is not really taking responsibility, but that can also be quite challenging. But at the same time, being the victim can also be quite comforting as well. But rather than sort of learning, one keeps making those same mistakes. And I was just kind of interested in Sananda's life, how he responded to some of those situations for himself, looking back on his life and taking those kind of challenging situations and how he sort of processed them and sort of moved forward. Indeed.
Well, we heal best from our pain. That's the best perspective we have in order to understand, like, the need for balance. And obviously Tony comes from having been bullied a lot when he was coming through. And so that's the essence of where his message is coming from. The heart of what his message is coming from is the victim mentality, because obviously as someone who was bullied, he would have had to have gone through that mentality for a while and have worn that mentality and then see the value of what it's really worth ultimately. The thing about the victim is how just conveniently, how convenient it is. It's look, we have a need to make sense of a larger world that largely we don't understand until we have enough experience to kind of comprehend what it means to us. It's human nature to blame what you don't understand because you didn't mean to fuck it up. You didn't even know you were fucking it up. And it's not as if you were given more tools than is necessary for us to be guided through the experience that our societies have kind of predetermined we should have. So we are taught the victim role because of its convenience for us, which also means that it's convenient for systems to take advantage of and with us, while knowing we won't blame it until it's perhaps the last resort after we've gotten through examining ourselves to see how much we were culpable for our failures or whatever our judgments of our lives are. For me, it wasn't a matter of failure. For me, it was a matter of breaking a pattern of blaming yourself for how you perform in impossible situations. In other words, there are situations we judge ourselves harshly where the thing was pretty much designed for the outcome to be what the outcome was, while we spend time in ignorance, blaming ourselves because we simply don't have enough of a larger picture to see the role that we played and the larger role it affected everyone else played their role in front of and behind the scenes. So
yes,
it's that for me was the greater challenge, is realizing that it didn't matter at some point what I would have said or what I would have done. The fix was in, if you will, because that's just the way of the system itself. And I just spent too much time blaming myself and not looking at the fact that things were set up to be pretty much as it went. You were either going to go this way or you were going to go this way. And either way, you were still going to have to, it's like no matter which direction you go in, if you go to the left, you go to the right, you still have to pay. Okay, there is no way around the fact that you have to pay for the price for this life. But what I found was the price I paid for living my life and my journey, I could afford. I could not have afforded the price of living someone else's journey and vision. That would have killed me.
Yes.
So the pain we lived was the pain we invested in the liberation of our life, being our life. Because like I said, you're going to pay either way. But you might as well pay the price of your living, of your life, of your vision, which then you see as an investment, as opposed to paying the price of living out someone else's vision and having a double death because you're not only ashamed that you didn't have the courage to support your vision of life, but that you also wind up suffering someone else's because someone else's vision wasn't really fit for you.
Indeed. And then I get into the subject of the live shows or the series of concerts that's happening and sort of putting together the set list and revisiting all the work from the early years right through to the latter years and how putting that sort of basic set list together feels and whether it's an enjoyable process.
That's the least exciting part of it. That's actually the part I most don't look forward to. But I don't go looking for the set list. I let the set list find me. If the set list knows where we are at any given point in time. It knows where we're going. It knows what we need to be doing, what we perhaps should focus on this time as opposed to last time. I don't see myself as involved in this process by myself. I see myself as part of a larger unit. Let's say the muses, as it were. I collaborate with the muses. And since this is a part of the intrinsic part of the very reason why, I sacrifice to have a life on earth, those things look after themselves. I just have to surrender to it and understand that I'm not in this alone and not try to dictate everything. What I do is listen. And at some point, I might smoke a bowl, a light boom, then sit down and let my mind open and I start listening. And it might be the very first song says, okay, yes, we start like this. Then slowly the crossword puzzle or the jigsaw puzzle just starts to show up. The rest of the pieces show up. And you trust that momentum. And occasionally, somebody like you will say, oh, Yuki Suzuki. And of course, it's like, I didn't put Yuki Suzuki on the set list this time. So now a part of me is like, oh, fuck, well, you maybe put Yuki Suzuki. So no, it's not easy. It's actually the most difficult part. Everybody's got something to say, which is why I don't ever tell anybody, even my wife, oh, hey, what about this? And oh, what about that? And she always says it's my fault for having written so many songs that, people love. But, that's the part where it's the actual toughest. Once the set list is done, once I know the songs, then I know I get to go to rehearsal and then have fun for 3 weeks.
And from that point, I just asked whether it was fun sort of working with other musicians and going through that process and the personal dynamics that happen at that time.
When I lived in California, I had 2 cars. I had a truck and a car and a truck. And basically I would alternate, like 1 week would be truck week, the next week would be car week, because one only enhanced my appreciation of the other. One week you're driving, you can see everything above the road, everything is clear, you've got this great visibility. The next week you're low to the ground in a sports car and you're off the road and it's like, oh, that's cool. And then after a week you want to be back in the other position. This was the same. It's like I record by myself, just me and an engineer. And I really love that. I really love not having to answer to anyone else's schedule, and the reality is by the time I would call the bass player, by the time he would come down, by the time I would teach him the part, I could have already done it. you know, and I can put the money that I would have paid him into buying another guitar. You know what I mean? So,
Yes.
but when it's time to then rehearse and go on the road, then equally that's exciting because I now get to hear my music interpreted by, you know, really competent musicians, you know, who I like spending time around.
And on that point, I'm curious and interested to know whether Sananda has any routines, or if he has a routine every day, whether it's meditation, yoga, athletics, running, or swimming. Anyway, this is the response.
Yeah, I do have a basic routine, but it just depends on the day. I don't sleep a lot. I get up really early, so. Oh, but I wanted to comment on something else. I just want to say that, you know, there are other colleagues. I do have colleagues that could make records the way I make records, you know, playing all the instruments and making all the decisions. But those people are differently emotionally constituted than I am. I have friends who couldn't dream of being in a studio, spending all the time by themselves and doing everything by themselves because they love the relationship between them and another person sparking off of each other. They love the emotional accompaniment of someone who comes in, hey, how you doing? Yeah, I mean, there are people who are capable of making records the way I make records, but just aren't, like I said, constituted in that way socially, where that would be fulfilling for them. You know, I'm the kind of person that instead of therapy, you know, there are other things that I have done to basically transition my psyche from the state of fuckery, which it was left in before, to a state much, much closer to, you know, something that, you know, can be navigated and even at times celebrated, thank God.
Yes.
But and recording is one of those things. You know, to have like at my disposal a studio and all this cool stuff and cool equipment and a relationship with an engineer that has gotten to the point of telepathy, yeah, that's a really huge part of my creative process in my life. And, you know, it's just, you know, and I treat my studios in such a way as I literally treat it like a shrine. I don't ever go in there to just hang out. It's a wonderful place, but I only go there when it's time to work because I treat it like a place of reverence where the spirit of music can be uplifted. And, you know, I see that the energy that you invest in those things definitely comes back to you in the ways in which, you know, you need it. And even in the way you hear the music has a lot to do with the vibrations that are in a studio that I treat as a place, you know, of serious consequence.
And on that point, I thought I'd be curious to know whether the creative process in the last 10 years has become easier because of such a prolific output of work. And yes, what has been happening in that direction?
Well, one of the first things you notice as an artist when you become free of all the other obligations that corporate associations can often, you know, bestow, if you will, is that when you, for example, I remember when I fired my last manager right before I left Los Angeles to come back to Europe, I lost like 12 pounds in 2 weeks. And I was not a big, chubby guy. But what I realized was the reason I was dropping so much weight is because I wasn't supporting so much weight anymore.
Right.
That dropping these associations were dropping people who were dependent upon me on some level, and that you become so used to that you don't kind of notice that it does have a cumulative effect on your psyche, weighing down your psyche. So once I was free of those obligations, like weight literally flew off my body like, well, you're not going to need this anymore. You don't need these shock absorbers anymore because you won't be carrying as much. So that's...
Was it comfort eating?
Was it complicated?
Was it comfort eating? Were you feeling like you were, you know, somehow sort of stuffing stuff in your face?
No, I wasn't eating more. I wasn't eating more than normally. But what happens is your body holds on to more when it feels like you need it. So that's, you know, it was as simple as that. The point I'm trying to make is that all of that energy that basically you were using to support the people around you, that energy turns back into available creative energy. So
Yes.
so you can use that energy to further fuel your, your creative ambition. And, my last 3 years in Malibu, the first 100 songs of Post Millennium Rock came during those last 3 years. It was an incredibly prolific time because I knew that after Wildcard, I knew that was the end of the road for trying to ever try to figure out again what I thought these motherfuckers could handle. Okay, it was becoming a barrier, and I was spending too much time then thinking about music as opposed to just allowing the expression and to collaborate with my psyche and just seeing what it is. Because I operate under the presumption that if I wasn't doing what I was doing, then specifically what I was doing, then it wouldn't exist. It just wouldn't exist. That no one else in particular would have this particular vision to make this particular music, and that it wouldn't exist in space time. And so that was why it was crucially important for me to take the invitation of all the inspiration and to do it, and just to outpace all this, this program and the need to, what is it? What do you call it? That's why I called it Post Millennium Rock, to name it before everyone else struggled to name it and putting something soul in it, just because the programming says if a person of color is doing it, we have to kind of shift it in this direction and call it this. And I preempted that by saying, well, they're going to label it, so you might as well label it first.
Indeed. Now, this brings us very interestingly to the latest studio album release, which was 2024, which was titled The Pegasus Project, which has got volumes 1 and 2. Volume 1 is A Horse That Flies. Volume 2, The Swan, and in brackets, That Never Dies. And I'm sort of curious about this piece of work and generally the last albums from the last, 5-10 years.
Well, yes, pretty much from Prometheus and Pandora, it was clear that it would need more space. Prometheus and Pandora is the beginning of then what is that particular trilogy of Prometheus and Pandora, Pandora's Playhouse, and then the Pegasus Project. Because the three main characters in that scenario are Pandora, Pegasus, and Prometheus. So each of them had to kind of claim their own individual space, because each of those albums was filtered through the psyche of the psychological filter I was wearing as Pandora, as Prometheus, as Pegasus. You can shape your vibrations. You can say to, let's say, the universe or to your imagination, hey, let's do like this. Let's pretend I'm this guy and I'm writing songs for this person. Sometimes as a songwriter, you do that just to throw a different shape at yourself. So sometimes literally as a songwriter, you'll say, okay, I'm Burt Bacharach and I'm writing a song for Rod Stewart. Okay? And then, of course, the frame, the shapes start to undulate in this kind of way. And then you start to direct from there where you want the music to go. So once the project announces itself, the shaping has already begun. It's not like, again, I have to do anything but just sit back and start to observe what happens now when I declare the next project is going to be called the Pegasus Project. Now, I've already placed absolute intention into rhythmic foundation, into vocalization, is a vibrational reality, as an echo into a universe that by its own nature must start sending that echo back at some point. These aren't metaphysical beliefs. These are actually the laws of physics. Mm-hmm. So sound or anything, intention being vibration, what comes out has to come back eventually. So if you know and trust that, okay, then you can say something like, oh man, I want to write a song for my hero, Rod Stewart. And the next day you wake up with a song called Holding On To You. You know, or I had a thing where Sade asked me to write her a song. So the next thing you know, I've got Sign Your Name. Those are physical realities. That's not just the imagination of somebody trying to explain a metaphysical event. It's like the metaphysical then becomes the physical, because it has to.
Yes. But does that vibration ever get?
And this is exactly, David, to go back full circle, what Tony Robbins is saying. If you play the victim, if you accept the role of the victim, your life will be interpreted and events will be interpreted through the consciousness of the victim. So why did I choose Prometheus? Because he's a fucking hero. Because he's heroic. Why did DC choose Iron Man and Marvel choose DC and Marvel? Why did they choose, why has every fucking movie in the past 20 years been a superhero movie? For the same reason Disney was successful. They took the archetypes of, let's say, Sumerian, Babylonian mythology, as it was Egyptian, Greco-Roman, African, all of that. It took these same archetypes and it keeps updating them so we could see the archetypes of our own human nature and our own truth, as well as the origin points of our own ancestry. Because I don't believe mythology is totally the imagination of humanity. I believe mythology is largely what we call pre-written history, pre-recorded history, before motherfuckers start writing things down, because why did they need to write things down? We were different people there. We were no less intelligent. Eventually, recorded history started to become important, obviously, for scientific, for evidential, whatever, the narrative, to make sure, yes, this was written, this was recorded. We know this is true because of it. So for me, Prometheus was anything but the victim. Prometheus said, listen, you know what? If you gods do not wish to be responsible for the humanity we created, because you become fat and lazy and you're more interested in your investments and your stocks than creating a better world and a better way through for the humanity we created, to pursue our wealth, to pursue our dreams, to pursue the work in these mines and all of it. And they thought Prometheus was just becoming problematic because he was basically reminding them of their conscience. He was their conscience. And they didn't want to deal with their conscience, so they petitioned Zeus, hey, we know you have a thing for your boy. We know you love your boy, but he's getting on our fucking nerves. And so at this point, it's either him or us. Now, you have to understand, Zeus was nervous about being overthrown by the other gods, and the reason was because the same gods helped him overthrow his father, the Titans. So it was a political decision. We need to get rid of the conscience of the gods because they are being bothered by it now. The same thing happens now because it's the same thing, is always the same thing. It's always, Promethean consciousness is always alive in the world, admonishing us to just be better with accountability in our responsibilities to our general humanity. So this is why Prometheus was chosen, because of all the Greco-Roman myths. Orpheus and Prometheus are the two that I've always found the most affinity to. And I just want to bring Pandora as a symbol of the energetic presence of Mother Earth, and Pegasus is also representative of, let's say, maybe what the Catholics regard, or the Christians, as the Holy Spirit, or that magical force. So this is why these three objects, these three people, and this is why, because there is such energy amassed around them, milking them like cows for creative inspiration is not very difficult. Because that's why they exist, to inspire us.
And on that point, I was very interested in the world of Earth energies, ley lines, the time of the moon, whether it's a waxing moon, a waning moon, things like the Glastonbury tour, Avebury, Stonehenge, these ideas of the St. Michael's ley line, the St. Margaret's ley line, and just how that also taps into Sananda's life, if it does, and this is his response.
The only thing, David, that separates us from the reality of life is education. If we're taught that those things are madness, or those things are not important, well, of course, those things aren't important to a society which is chosen to go in another direction. Okay, but to my mind, all we are is energy any fucking way. It's just energy. Your energy, I'm energy. What isn't energy? If it's visible because of the density of its energy. If it's invisible, it's only invisible because of it has no density within the range of the frequency range of vision that we are given and we call human vision in our frequency range. If we can't hear it, we know it exists if it's outside of our hearing range because our dogs can hear it. Basically, as above, so below just makes sense, and it always has made sense. So if our body has veins, if our body has lines that are much stronger pulsing energy than other lines, it only stands to reason that our Mother Earth has the same principles. It just doesn't stand to reason that anything that comes from Earth is any different from the basic blueprint of Earth, because the basic blueprint of the stars is in everything. It's just a compositional issue, and that's all. And what the focus of that particular energy is. It's this compositional makeup. But ley lines make sense if you believe that the body has a pulse, if you believe that, and you can see that there are certain veins that are visible, that the body says that's that important for you to see that I make them visible. So Glastonbury and all those places, yes, of course. Just as like every major city had surveyors who were usually masons, who were usually trained in these realities, and made sure that they placed the places where the energy was coming up from the ground. Places where the energy is kind of going into the ground, we tend to gravitate towards other functions and other things. But these are the things that without education, we can even feel that they are true. But then we start going to school, and at some point, we start buying into a much more, not empirical, but a much more pedantic and didactic world where if we can't see it, if we can't smell it, it does not exist, basta. Okay, no problem for those who want to narrow their focus on accomplishing certain things that have nothing to do with getting back in touch with that wisdom, because who says you have to anyway? Life still goes on, regardless of whether you believe in it or not.
And on that subject, I was curious really whether Sananda had done any past life therapy sessions and anything kind of connected to that particular subject.
Like anyone else, if I'm really curious, I just have to ask. Oftentimes we are given these presentations in dreams, oftentimes in visions. But again, if we're not taught to trust ourselves, we doubt everything that is outside the purview of what we have been taught to accept as someone else's reality. Reality is a construct that we have to basically, as a civilization, agree within this frame, within this space between here and here, we're going to call this reality. Because, of course, there are people with narrower vision. There are people with wider vision. But the sacrifice we make for a thing we call collective civilization is sharing a collective reality that we have to project and say, okay, if it fits inside this box, that is what we will accept as credible. Otherwise, no, it's just too much, okay? So we all agree that we would go along with this. So obviously there are people walking among us who have a wider range of what they perceive to be possible or real, but they understand that not everyone else does, and they don't want the discomfort of being labeled some kind of idiot or some kind of person simply for the sin of being able to see more than someone else or to perceive more than someone else, okay? If we have had traumas pretty early in our life, it does tend to either limit our perceptions to a more traumatized narrower space, or the trauma can even open up Pandora's box and you can see more than your neighbor can see. But generally, because it was produced by a trauma that kind of forced open your perceptions in a way that you weren't anticipating. But if I was to sit down in therapy, it would have to be a group therapy because they would need like 5 or 6 therapists at once. Because I would have these people leaving the office like cartoons when you like burst through the wall, like those it's just too much. And so, like I said, if I want to know anything, I just ask. And then it may take a couple of days, but then I accept the reality that comes, and then I can unravel it from there. And sometimes without asking, we just see things. Because when it's time for us to know, we know.
And on that subject, I was also sort of curious, especially as we were coming towards the end of the interview, What projects were potentially on the horizon for 2026?
Sananda.org/tour for any tour information. I have this particular situation whereby usually middle of one project, the next project starts to suggest itself and move into place. That's something I've bore witness to my whole career. And such is the case this time as well. Yes, I do know what the next project is. I do know what its title is. And I do know that because it's my 14th project of original music, the idea, at least, is to limit it to 14 songs. But as far as 2026, no, I promised myself with this last project that I would just kind of slow the pace a little bit just to allow myself to appreciate this part of my life, these years. I've never been 63 before. So, 26 is unrealistic, probably because I'll commit to more live work next year. But I could probably see somewhere around 27 going back into the studio and with the next project. But the blessing of not having any accountability to any industry other than my own is I don't have to live in this kind of unnatural pace. I can record as often or as little as I'm inspired.
And on that subject, I was curious if there was any live dates for 2026.
We have things that are percolating to be considered, but the question is really whether or not we're going to, how we're going to start. We're doing Europe next year, basically. So the question is whether I start during festival season or whether we take another tack. Because once I get the show together, I don't like taking gigs where I have to, make too many compromises as far as the set length, because it kind of negates a lot of the work you put together arranging the show to flow the way you're hoping that it flows. So those are the only questions. For sure, everything's on the table, and it's just a blessing that people are still, after all this time, interested to see us live. We're so very grateful, and we just petition them to come out. And also, like David, it's important that when we put this idea together of me coming back, it took as long as it did because I wanted to make sure that everything was ready to receive me as Sananda Maitreya, and I didn't have to deal with a bunch of other confusion or any more than normally one would perhaps expect at this point. And it was really important for me to put it back or bring it back in as intimate a space as possible. So this is why we chose clubs and not like theaters or halls or, bigger places, because to reintroduce this artist who sacrificed his career so that his vision could be fulfilled, and now moving into the greater part of my career, I needed this to be in an intimate place where we didn't have to worry about anything other than presenting the purity of the music, where we didn't have to worry about too much of a sophisticated type of presentation or stage show, and the flip side of having sort of like shot to prominence is that I didn't have enough time in the smaller venues where I could really just develop this more intimate rapport with the audience before it became basically, next thing you know, you're playing in front of 200,000 people. And, the problem with playing in front of 200,000 people is after 100,000 people, you lose count.
Indeed, and as we really do come towards the end of the interview, I'd sort of mention whether he has become the David Jones to the David Bowie, which was like Davy Jones, or David Jones is the real person, whereas David Bowie was the sort of character played. And I just wonder if Sananda had also felt life was like that as well, and if it was more balanced or more honest.
I was blessed to not have to make anything that didn't represent the real me, but the real you dealing with every context is what art is about. So Rodin, who I'm a massive fan of his work, his sculptures when he was with Camille Claudel, when he was happy, was presenting in a different type of form than he was when he was before. Point being is that an artist doesn't just create from the material in their hands, they're creating also from the context of their life. So the record that you managed to make while the record company is just beating you to be as conformist as possible and still managing to sneak through work that you're proud of, that has to be taken in context as a part of why that work was that work. You know, so it's not that I've ever been misrepresented or felt that I was misrepresented. It's just that after Wildcard, I didn't have to consider anything else other than just following as purely the muse and not how I could also accommodate this vision. How can I take a fourth dimensional imagination and reduce it into a three-dimensional format? I didn't have to do that anymore.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Sananda Maitreya for giving me the time for that. As I said, I'll put a link to his website in the notes below, but he's going to be touring October, November 2025. Do check out all his albums, especially the latter years, because certainly have got a lot of gems on there. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on any of the social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Stay safe.